Anne-Marie Dulèche, Larry Goldstein,
Here.
Steve Julesgaard,
Here.
David Martin,
Here.
Shlomo Melmed,
Here.
Joe Panetta, Barry Selick,
Here.
Michael Stamos,
Here.
Jonathan Thomas,
Here.
Art Torres,
Here.
Carol Watson. Okay. We do have a quorum.
Perfect. Thank you, Mary Ann. So we have on the agenda a single topic. There may be other things that come up again, but this is what we're meeting to focus on. For quite some time now, I think going back to maybe 2012, somewhere in that time frame, we put in place for translational awards. This also, by the way, is true for other awards, but this meeting is focused on the translational award, sort of the earliest of the awards that go to the development of a potential therapeutic product. That for-profit companies would need to provide co-funding in a translational award setting. So in order to receive $4 million in translational award funding, they would need to co-fund $1 million. And at the time that we did this, and so it's been some time ago, I think the general sense is that the companies that would be involved in coming to the table would be more established companies, either publicly traded companies or well-funded venture companies, and that they could, well afford to contribute $1 million and have their own investment side by side with CIRM. As time has gone on, and certainly in the more recent period, the last couple of years anyway, I think what we've begun to see, and I'm going to have Sean Patel and Abla Krisi talk to this in a moment, is the involvement of a lot more very early stage companies. These are companies that in a number of cases haven't even received any venture funding yet, but they're at the friends and family or angel investor round. So they're trying to raise enough money to keep going, to have enough substance in the work that they're doing that will actually ultimately attract venture funding. And along with that, there's become a bit of an issue with regard to being able to put $1 million on the table for companies that are in that particular group. And so what I wanted to discuss and have us consider is actually removing that requirement. And in this case, just limited right now to the translational award area. So remember, translational awards are at the very earliest stages. In rereading the requirements for a translational award, and I guess we have Gil, you're on the line, right? So you can correct me if I go astray. But the candidate has to have an actual molecule that they want to proceed with, and that molecule needs to be the same one that they've used to conduct their early animal studies to demonstrate some early stage efficacy. So it's really at the very, very advent of the whole process of trying to get a product through the whole development channel, and ultimately, hopefully, FDA approval and then commercialization. So there's a lot that's really unknown. The translational area, to be honest, from an investing point of view, is a more high risk area, unless you're investing, in a platform or something that's a little more tried and true, where the path has already been trod by others. Unless it's that kind of situation, the translational involvement is really a fairly high risk population, because there's a lot that's unknown that's going to be demonstrated by the pre-IND studies and ultimately an IND filing with the FDA. So I'm going to pause there because I was just trying to kind of lay a bit of the landscape on the line, and ask Sean and Abla to talk a little more specifically about what we're seeing with respect to the for-profit applicants in this area.
Thank you. So I'll start off giving you a little bit of background on the program, the types of applicants we get, and then Dr. Alba Creasy will fill in some of the details about the profiles of the grantees because her team manages these awards at this point. So as Steve mentioned, the translational stage funding opportunity is what we would call the prototypical translational valley of death type of research, which is that they have a candidate and we fund them to progress to having a well-planned pre-IND meeting. And that would then set them up for IND-enabling studies going from there. For-profit applicants to CIRM have two requirements. The first is an eligibility requirement that they must maintain solvency for 6 months at the time that they apply. And the second applies to translational stage grantees and later is a co-funding requirement, which ramps up with 20% co-funding at a translational stage up to a 50% co-funding requirement if they were to apply for a phase 3 clinical trial in the clinical program. So as Steve rightly noted, for a translational stage award, the co-funding obligation for a for-profit applicant or a grantee could be $1 million, could be a little bit more than that, depending on what they're asking for CIRM. So over the last 5 years, I've done the solvency and co-funding eligibility for every single for-profit application that comes to CIRM. So from translation to clinical. And the profile of the translational grantee and applicant is something I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on. So first of all, roughly 23% of eligible TRAN applicants are for-profit companies, and 21% of TRAN awards are for-profit companies. So what that would tell you is that we're getting about a fifth of the applicants at the translational stage are companies, and they're actually competing quite well in terms of being able to get CIRM award funding at the end of the day with respect to matching up the proportions. And there's been a rise in the number of for-profit applicants in the last few rounds. So under Prop 14, we're actually getting a doubling of the number of translational companies applying for the TRAN round. But again, that's still a small fraction of the overall. Most of the company applicants are still nonprofit applicants for the translational program. So what are the types of companies that apply to a translational funding opportunity? As Steve mentioned, these are almost all small preclinical stage companies. They're often requesting funding for their lead candidate. And about, I would say a majority of them are seed stage companies. They're relying on friends and family funding, angel investments, as well as grants, particularly NIH Small Business Innovation Research grants. The next most common companies are Series A companies, often with smaller Series A rounds than what you normally see in the media. But they either are in the process of raising that Series A funding or have secured at least the first tranche of that. And so with that in mind, these are small companies that are actively raising funds. They often are relying on seed stage funding. That's a typical translational applicant and grantee when it comes to for-profit companies. We have awarded 10 translational awards to for-profit companies, and 6 of these were actually awarded in the past year. So that just gives you an idea as to the uptake in translational for-profit grantees. And these have all been small private preclinical stage companies, as I mentioned. So at this point, I'll let Dr. Alba Creasy elaborate a little bit more on the types of grantees that we funded under translational and what they're doing with their funding.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to describe my current experience with the Translation Award. I became responsible for that effort only recently. But in that setting, I just wanted to reiterate that in general, funding for TRAN-like applications has been essentially hard to get. Most of the grantees tell us that they are in need of funds and they're very grateful to CIRM for doing that. So we had projected that we would only get 5 to 6 TRAN grants in this last round, and we actually got 11 approved by you. And so it seems, as again confirmed by what Steve and Sham said, there is an increase in interest in applying to CIRM, and also because there's lack of funding by everyone else. mostly invested with philanthropy or family investments, etc. So currently in our grants management system, we have 47 awards, 30 are active, 11 closed, 4 terminated, and 1 declined. 3 of the closed 11 are funded by industry, they're small industry, and all continue to be in development. So they progress well compared to the average out there. The last round of TRAN, which was on August 19th, 24 applied, 19 were found eligible, and 11 of the 19 were approved for funding. 5 of the active are fundings that are small industry applicants. When we actually work with these grantees for potential applications, we get to know them a little bit better. And I just wanted to kind of share an experience I've had with 3 of the 11 that actually got 3 of the 26 that applied, 11 of whom were approved. And all 3 reiterated how grateful they were to CIRM. And one stands out in my mind because that head of that small industry startup mentioned that he was using his father's trust money to support the co-funding. And for that reason, when Stephen, discussed with us potential kind of consideration of minimizing the co-funding or removing that co-funding, it struck a chord in my mind relative to like how people struggle in order to make that co-funding requirement in order to enable them to apply to us. And remember, we're in the business of acceleration. We help them attain their goals. And so it's with that spirit, I'm provided you all that data. Any questions?
Sorry, Abla, I don't date. Apologies for that. I'll catch up with you separately.
Okay, no worries. I was just mentioning the experiences we've had with the TRAN applicants, especially those from industry, who spoke about how difficult it is to find the co-funding requirement, which amounts to about $1 million. And the one experience I reiterated was the one where one of the applicants said that the small company had to use his father's trust money to provide that co-funding requirement. Oh, there's a question from Dr. Goldstein. Go ahead, please.
I think Kim was before me. Kim, any problem if I go ahead?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see Kim.
Go ahead, Larry.
Thank you, Kim. I guess a comment and a question. I mean, it's pretty well known in and around the industry that cash is really expensive for small companies. They've got plenty of equity to give away. That's something to keep an eye on. But it's very hard for early stage companies, particularly those before the clinical stage, to have very much cash on hand. Abla, I guess the question is, you gave a very poignant and useful example. How frequent do you think it is that companies that apply are really stretching to meet the co-funding requirement? And B, do you have any feel for companies out there who are not applying because of the co-funding requirement? Is that common? Is it rare?
Again, given the fact that I just took charge of this effort just recently, so I don't have a historical database, but the idea though, having worked in industry, both in large molecules, small molecules, et cetera, in general, industry at the very early stage struggle. And so my sense is that some are not able to apply to us because of the co-funding requirement. I'd say if I were to guess, probably maybe 20%. But we are starting to see an increase in the industry applications. It's better than the first round we saw. That's why, like I said, we budgeted only 5 to 6, and this time it doubled. But again, I think the solvency issues often Sham covers, and maybe he can answer that question more clearly.
Yeah, certainly. So as Avila mentioned, we suspect that there are companies that self-select, looking at our eligibility requirements and application requirements. Of the ones who do apply, there have been several cases where they have not been able to meet either the solvency or co-funding eligibility requirement and had to either not submit the application or to submit later. So that is an ongoing concern that potentially with this sort of requirement being lifted, then potentially we can get more applications coming in. And I think, as Avila mentioned, every small company is putting in a lot of their own money to fund the operations of those companies. So especially if this is a lead candidate they're progressing, then they're putting a lot of funding into just keeping the company going and supporting all the activities necessary outside of just the research that is being funded by CIRM.
Kim?
Yeah, I had basically the same question as Larry. Do we have a sense of how much more competitive this competition might be if we are opening things up by removing this requirement? And I'm not speaking against the action that's proposed, but I just wanted to get a sense of if the floodgates open, how many are out there?
Frankly, it's very hard to get to a translation stage with cell and gene therapy. Again, as a person who's worked in the area. And so I'd say the floodgates may open, but not likely, because you have to have essentially a candidate that you start out with. And we recently had an experience where we had to turn people down because they belonged more to DISC 2 than to TRAN. And so I'd say it's probably, there may be some increase, but I don't think we're going to quadruple or whatever, but that's my personal opinion.
Barry?
Thanks, Steve. Avila, this question is either for you or maybe Sham. If someone is unable to come up with matching funds or even the minimum, what sort of diligence do we do to ensure that they actually have the infrastructure and the wherewithal to utilize the funding that they're going to get from CIRM?
Our TRAN applications also have milestones. In fact, part of having me be responsible for it, we set up important milestones upfront, knowing closely, monitoring their spending, as well as whether they achieve what they plan to achieve during the 30 months exercise. And so my sense is that we have not had, we've only had one, we had one terminated out of the 47 because of not able to manage some of the work.
Okay, thank you.
Vera, let me just add to that. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, and having a little personal experience in this area. So sometimes what happens is the fact that you get a CIRM grant in the translational area, you get the assurance of that money and you get the imprimatur of the GWG. It actually helps you raise more money to keep going. So there's that, that helpful situation with a CIRM grant for companies that are struggling. Dave, you're on mute.
This may be a little bit out of context, and it's rather than debating the issue on the table directly. What about providing an option to the applicant to either pay the whatever 20% in cash, or we grant CIRM warrants?
Right. So we have discussed that amongst ourselves with the team. It is certainly something that's potentially doable. it's going to be, the exercise is going to be one of figuring out, how many warrants to ask for, right? I mean, what metric are we going to use to determine that? I take it the warrants would be granted at whatever the current, price for that company is. They use a valuation model called 409A to establish valuation of shares in very young companies of that sort. So you've got a price that you can peg to. It's just the number of shares, what percentage of the outstanding equity, would you ask for? I think if we're going to do that, and I'm not either in favor or opposed to, I think it's something that we could take a look at. But we need to come forward with an actual proposal of how that would work. What model would we use to come up with a number? So an interesting notion. Let's put that on the table for now, because let's see what other questions there are, and when we can come to that. So Michael, you're next.
Thanks. Yeah, just sort of piling on a little bit. First of all, Stephen makes a really good point about the chicken and the egg part. I get that. But the question I have really is the lack of solvency and the lack of ability to co-fund sort of part of the process of natural selection of survival of these companies and ability of them to pull this off? I mean, there may well be some truth to that, right? We don't know unless we test it. If we do approve it, I like David's idea personally. So they have something in the game, some contribution.
Thank you. Anne-Marie?
Yeah, as I'm on the board of a private biopharma company, but since I started on CIRM, I've switched gears, and my full-time job is in a patient advocacy organization, nonprofit. That's PanCan. Some of you may know that. The reason why I mentioned that is because now I'm part of an organization that looks at drug development differently, and that is trying to help a field that struggles, particularly biopharma that struggles to get money, pancreatic cancer being the graveyard of clinical development in cancer, very much like companies working on stem cell research struggle. It's very similar. And what we're doing to advance the field are, putting money on the table for phase 2 and phase 3, but asking the companies to put, I don't know if it's an equivalent amount of money, but to put money on the table as well. One step further, we recently created a Therapeutic Accelerator award to the tune of $5 million to help companies that are struggling earlier in their development stage, being translational, but asking them also to put money on the table. And in the end, I know it's a struggle for companies to do that, but it guarantees two things. One, I don't know that it guarantees, but it helps guarantee two things. One is quality, and to some extent, the Darwinian explanation that you just gave is pretty right, spot on. And second, a commitment, long-term commitment. So I would still think that as hard as it is for companies, this is good to do.
JT?
So question, Sean, when you were reviewing sort of the description, the fiscal description of applicants these days, do we have any well-heeled translational applicants, or virtually all of them very early stage of the kind you're describing?
They tend to range. So there are venture-backed companies that do apply to CIRM and have gotten CIRM funding. There's also, so to clear up a little bit of so with respect to solvency, every for-profit applicant needs to demonstrate that they have at least 6 months of runway when they apply to CIRM. And so we confirm that with cash on hand. With respect to co-funding, they could either have that cash on hand at the time of application, or they need to have a plan showing that they are going to be able to raise that money over the course of the award. And that's where we see a lot of times contingent funding coming in from angel investors, friends and family, or VCs as part of that commitment requirement. And then going back to your original question, JT, yes, there are well-heeled companies applying to CIRM for translational awards, but the vast majority of those are the earlier stage companies that are looking to develop their first candidate and using seed stage financing or really early Series A financing.
So if there are some well-heeled companies, have you guys talked about sort of different tiers of funding requirements based on how well-heeled or not an applicant is? Or are you looking to have sort of a across the board policy, regardless of how well heeled one might be when applying.
But we haven't had that discussion, and I think it's one worth having. I'm going to stop just for a moment, ask Sean. So Sean, public companies, do we have any public companies applying for translational awards that you know of?
So I can comment on the 10 that have been awarded because that is public information, and none of those were
at the time of the award.
At the time of the award, none of them were public.
Right. So we're dealing in the private company, the non-public company world. Okay. So now we're dividing them up between, I guess, well-heeled and not well-heeled companies. So I think that, it's a line drawing exercise, JT. You'd have to figure out where you thought that line was, just in terms of how much cash on hand the organization needed to have before you said that you're well-heeled enough that we're going to require you to put up money. But anyway, let's put that aside for a moment, because Barry, you have a question, then Dave, or a comment, and then Dave.
Yeah, thanks again, Steve. One of the goals of this is to increase the number and diversity of applicants that we get coming into CERM. So JT, coming back to your point about well-heeled and not so well-heeled, is there any correlation between how interesting and potentially valuable the proposals are that come from the well-heeled companies as opposed to the less well-heeled companies? Because one could make the argument that actually some of the more interesting ones may come from the higher risk, less well-heeled companies.
And Dave?
Just a quick comment. If an entity, an applicant had a choice of warrants, granting warrants or paying cash, most of the well-heeled ones would say, stay away from the warrants. I'll give you the cash. But if the opposite, they don't have the cash. And so it may be sort of self-selecting, I think, in my guess. It's a guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a fair point. Again, we're back to trying to figure out, at some point, even a non-well-heeled company is going to be reticent to give warrants if you, depending upon the number that you're asking for. Because it's going to impede downstream fundraising. There's already a dilution going on before even the first, major investment at Series A. So, and sometimes you'll see, a Series A investor making having certain requirements before they'll fund regarding outstanding warrants at that point.
But if they had an option to pay it off.
Well, I don't know, how would you pay a warrant?
No, I mean, you originally.
Oh, you mean
20% of the grant, et cetera, and instead you granted options. And then at the time of funding from a venture fund, the entity could pay off after.
Buy the warrants back for $1 million. Is that what you're saying? For the 20%?
Yeah, sure.
Or any time along the way.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Interesting idea. Let me ask, let me not, because I see Larry's got his hand raised. So if you want to go ahead, and then I want to ask Sean what he thinks about the warrant issue.
Yeah, I was just going to make the point that I think we're all aware of the sort of long-term experience in the industry where there are serious investment bubbles, where a lot of money will go into a particular area that's very hot. And so you'll have a bunch of well-heeled companies in that area and others that are doing less sexy stuff at the time that the emphasis in the field changed, who actually have long-term value. And so I don't think that the presence of money in a company's bank account is always a good guide to what its long-term prospects are going to be. Think about the genomics boom, which I think in many ways kind of fizzled out. And I think, it was harder to turn that area into products than a lot of investors realized.
Fair enough. Let me go back to asking Sean what he thinks about the warrant issue regarding applicants.
So we would look at this two ways. First of all, would it be something that CERM can actually do? And that's a question where there is some precedent here with respect to what Dr. Milan has mentioned previously, which is the ATP3 program. That was a funding opportunity that was explored a few years ago, and that did involve this type of a mechanism being built into that. So there could be some precedent for CERM to be able to allow that sort of an type of co-funding arrangement. And then secondly, is this within scope for a lot of the companies that apply to CERM at the translational stage? And so we do see a lot of companies that are, at the note and warrant stage, and they have safes these days as well. And who are they getting them from? So they could be angel investors, also a lot from incubator facilities. So if they're setting up shop in an incubator facility, that often it comes with that type of arrangement as well. So in that respect, at least some of these earlier stage companies are already used to seeing those types of terms from even just the facilities where they're housing their companies. And so it could be something that they might be amenable to in some respect. So that was the two areas. One is whether it's something that CERM can do, and there could be a pathway for that. And secondly, is it something that the companies that apply to CERM are used to seeing? And that is also true.
Thanks. So I just want to make a few comments, if you don't mind. The first is that I think, one of the priorities of CERM is to encourage research and development for hopefully new therapeutics in the regenerative medicine and gene therapy space. And I think the more that we can do to encourage that research and development, the more we're meeting what I think is one of the principal missions of CERM, which is to use the power of these two areas to try and help meet unmet medical needs. And the more we can do to encourage that, I think, is something that CERM ought to consider doing. The second is that if you look at who the other applicants are for translational awards, it's academic institutions who don't have a co-funding obligation. And they have already built in benefits or advantages over a small nonprofit or a small for-profit company. They've got a whole infrastructure that gets supported, otherwise just on an ongoing basis. And then CERM kicks in up to 50% of the award in some cases to help keep, with respect to the overhead costs. And these young companies have created their own infrastructure, and they're supporting them with whatever money they're getting from whoever the investors are they're getting them from. And in addition to that, now they're seeking money to work on a particular award. I just want to ask Sham, because my understanding is that in our grants we provide either none or just a little in terms of the overhead or infrastructure costs in the grants to the for-profit company world. Is that right?
So with the nonprofit and for-profit, at the translational stage, as you mentioned, the direct project cost amount is the same for both. With respect to the indirects and direct facilities, the direct facilities that both nonprofits and for-profits can request, and there's the indirect costs on top of that, which only the nonprofit can request, and a for-profit cannot. So there is that additional funding that a nonprofit can get that a for-profit cannot with respect to indirect funding.
Right. So my only point is that there's, and it's not an intentional one, but nonetheless, and I'll use the word bias, it may be a bit of a prejudicial term, but a bit of a bias financially, built in favor of the academic and research organization world and against the for-profit world. And again, I'm not arguing for all for-profits, getting a break. I am more focused on the ones that I think are more struggling at the very beginning, and where they struggle is in the translational area. And I'm doing this based upon some particular experience that I've had recently with an organization that did get funding, but really ultimately got funding. The GWG granted them a score of 85, but it was difficult getting to the table for them, and they might not have made it otherwise. And I thought, in my experience, that was it would have been a shame for that to happen. I just would remind everybody at the end of the day, no matter what the company is, they still have to have a project that's of scientific merit as far as the GWG is concerned, because we very seldom grant awards for anything that has a score of of at least 85. So I think the one thing that's come out of this, which is kind of left, one thing anyway for me, and that kind of left undone, is whether there's an alternative to money, and that is warrants. And I don't want to, I think that's an important enough issue that maybe we should take this back at this point and internally and have some discussion about whether or not we could come up with a model for thinking about that we could bring back to this committee. That's assuming we're willing to consider that. So if there's if there's enough of a vote in favor of relooking at the $1 million or 20% co-funding requirement, if there's enough favorable support for that, then I would move that we or have us go back and basically look at the alternative of warrants and how that might work, and then come back to the committee with a proposal built around either money or warrants. So let me just pause there and see if there are any other comments or questions.
I think if you proposed a motion that we try to address this to the benefit of all the stakeholders in this, the California citizens, patients, and small, creative, struggling companies, by trying to solve this problem. And one option is to waive for certain entities the cash requirement. The other is to develop some type of alternative that provides a choice of how to benefit all the stakeholders.
All right, Larry?
So at the risk of boring you all to tears, nonetheless, let me point out that the other place where we see this kind of issue with small startups is in the area of orphan indications. So diseases that are very rare and where it's hard to get large amounts of grant money or venture financing of any sort because the patient pools are small. And so you might say, well, why do we care if we lose orphan indications from our portfolio? It's only a small number of patients. But remember, it is often the case that a therapy that's used broadly or method that's used broadly in a population was initially developed using orphan indications. So just have a look at Don Cohn's work, where really he's making progress along a very difficult path, but with orphan indications where the risk is very it's a reasonably high risk, but the potential benefit to these kids is just enormous, and they really have unmet medical needs.
Thanks. So I think what I would like to do, and this is sort of a less official way of doing it, but it's kind of a test the waters approach. I'd like to kind of, for each of us, just so I can get kind of a straw vote here. And this is not, we can do an actual vote after this, but to get the sentiment of the group, if we could go through kind of with each member and express whether you're in favor of changing the financial requirement, and then two, if you are, whether you would like to see warrants as an alternative to cash or not. And then I think with that, so you get a sense, because if there's not even any enough sentiment to want to change the current paradigm, then there's no reason to explore the second part, which is warrants in lieu of cash. So I guess we could do this in a motion sense and then have a second motion, or but I'd like to at least try and clear the underbrush on whether this concept of substitution, or relinquishment of the requirement of the co-funding, whether that's a viable alternative or not for this group. So let's just, without doing this as a motion, I would like to just proceed that way, and then we can do something more formally. So Marianne, would you just call the roll of people and let's see what people say one way or the other?
Sure. Kim Barrett,
I'm in favor of a change, and I'm in favor of exploring the warrant question.
Okay, perfect.
Anne-Marie Dulage,
Yes, same, yes for both.
Okay,
Larry,
Yes, for both.
all right. Steve, Jules Guard,
yes.
okay, yep. David Martin,
I agree with what was said. Yeah.
okay. Shlomo Malmed,
Yes to both.
Barry Selleck,
And yes to both as well.
Michael Stamos,
Yes to both.
Jonathan Thomas,
Yes to both, although Steve, I still think we may need to take a look from the data on whether or not there should be a tiered approach. If you've got somebody applying who's got a very healthy Series A raise in place, that's very different from a company that may just be dealing with early seed funding and struggling a lot more. So
Fair point.
Art Torres,
Hi to both. Thank you for a valuable discussion.
and Carol Watson. She's not here. Okay.
All right, well, then I should have staged this as a motion. So let's do it real quickly formally and consider the people that approved this as having approved the motion, so we don't go through it again. So is there a motion that we?
So moved.
Okay, Senator Torres, and is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, just say aye.
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 So
Aye.
for the roll call, Mary, I just consider all the people that we went through as having been in favor.
Okay, motion carries.
And then just as a side, JT, we'll take a look at the company. Well, I'd be interested in seeing what we're talking about in terms of the companies that are applying and how much wherewithal they have. So we can factor that in as well in our next analysis. So we'll go home and do some more homework and come back in some period of time and visit this again. But thank you. It's been a very helpful discussion, at least for me anyway. So
Thank you, Steve. Take care.
Thank you.